Snow pressed quietly over the hills so that every fence, hollow, and track lay hidden. And the Rowley farmhouse sat in the middle of it with a thin gray thread of smoke curling from the chimney. Margaret Ashford stood at the gate and strained to hear the signs that prove a house. Leg, a kettle lid rattling, a child's uneven footsteps. But the air held only the slow creak of the wind pump and the muffled sigh of snow falling from the eaves. It had been 3 days since anyone saw Thomas or Anna Rowley. 3 days of smoke from the chimney and no footprints on the lane, and something in that balance felt wrong enough for her to cross the drifted yard. The latch lifted without resistance, as though the door had been waiting for her. The kitchen struck her first with its warmth, thick and close, the kind that clings to a body. The cast-iron stove's mouth glowed low and steady. The fire banked down under ash like an ember pretending to sleep. A loaf of bread sat half-cut beside a knife, the blade pointing inward, and a pat of butter sweated on its plate. A cup steamed faintly on the sill. 2 chairs were pulled away from the table as if backs still warmed them, yet the air was still as stone. Margaret called their names, soft at first, then sharper. Her voice reached into the beams and came back to her smaller than it left. On the floor she noticed a line of soot, thin and deliberate, running from the stove to the center of the room. It was too neat to be an accident, the kind of line a careful hand could make with a damp cloth and ash, ending abruptly in the square of sunlight falling across the boards. The rest of the room was clean, too clean for a winter morning in a working house. Boots stood ready by the back door, their soles dry. Coats hung in pairs. A child's wooden rattle sat polished on the shelf. The scene felt arranged, not abandoned. She moved through the hallway like someone walking through another person's dream. In the bedroom, the bed was turned down but not slept in. A comb lay on the dresser with 3 strands of hair laid across its teeth, parallel and even. The children's room was tidied with unnatural care, toys in a perfect row, bed covers smoothed flat without a crease. Everything looked touched but untouched, as though used for the last time under instruction. Back in the kitchen, the bread drew her eye. The cut edge was dense and heavy, a seam of gray in the crumb like something folded inside and baked into place. She did not cut further. The air near the stove held a smell not quite wood and not quite food, sweet and sour at once, like something burnt that should never have been cooked. Margaret crouched to open the ash door, and heat rolled over her face. The soot line seemed to sharpen in the warmth, its edges glittering faintly as if ground with fine grit. She opened the back door and looked out. Snow lay unbroken in the yard, the orchard's bare trees etched black against the white. The well near the far tree had a new board nailed over it, the nails straight and clean, the work of careful hands. She shut the door and stood still, listening. The stove gave a soft sigh, almost like a breath. She understood then that the fire had been kept alive for a reason, just enough heat to last until someone came to see. Whoever had stood here last had been patient, precise, and unhurried, the kind of person who makes absence look like a table set for supper. Margaret stepped back to the threshold, her eyes catching on a faint oval on the wall above the table, where something had hung for years and been taken down, leaving pale wood beneath. She thought of the bread, of the gray seam hidden inside, of the soot drawn in a straight path to nowhere, and knew without proof that the Rowleys had not walked out by choice. The house felt neither abandoned nor grieving. It felt obeyed. She pulled the door closed behind her, the warmth still on her skin, and crossed the yard without looking back. The chimney's smoke rose steadily into the white sky, marking the moment when a home stops being a home and becomes the last stage of someone else's quiet work. Sheriff Elias Dorn arrived at the Rowley place before dawn, the light still trapped beneath the ridge and the cold holding tight to the ground. He had seen plenty of farmhouses left empty by sickness or flight, but never one that breathed so softly in its vacancy. The snow at the threshold was undisturbed, crisp from the last storm, with not a track to mark a visitor. Inside, the warmth lingered as if someone had just stepped away, but the air felt wrong, thick in the lungs, faintly metallic. He moved from room to room with the deliberate care of a man taking in every absence. The coats hung by the door, lined in a row from largest to smallest. Boots stood upright beneath them, dry and clean. A small stack of coins rested on the counter beside a pocket watch, its chain curled in a perfect loop, as though placed there with a steady hand that wanted them to be found. The table still bore the remains of a meal. Bread cut into uneven slices, a pot of stew gone cold, spoons resting where they'd been set down. It was a picture of lives paused, not ended. Dorn searched for a breach, a splintered frame, a latch forced by frost or by hand. But every lock was set, every window fastened from within. The bedding was turned down but not slept in. The children's room carried the faint smell of soap and oil. The dolls polished their painted eyes, catching the weak light. In the cellar, he found shelves of preserved fruit and jars of cured meat, untouched. He noticed the kind of order that came not from daily use, but from an arrangement meant to be judged. Every object squared to its neighbor, labels facing forward. It was not the chaos of a family leaving in haste, nor the rot of neglect. It was preparation. When he rode back into town, the snow muffled his arrival, but already the whispers had begun. Some said Thomas Rowley had borrowed more than he could repay from a coal buyer in Charleston, and the debt had come calling in the night. Others lowered their voices further, speaking of the orchard's soil and the families who had worked it before. There were stories of land that took back what was owed, not in coin but in flesh, and of certain people who knew how to mark a family for collection. Dorn listened without answering. He knew the way fear works, how it clings to the simplest explanations until the ground shifts beneath it. He wrote his notes that night in the lamp's circle of light, careful to mark what was there and what was not. No tracks, no break, no theft, no sign of a struggle, the kind of vanishing that leaves the shape of the people behind, like pressed flowers without their color. The Rowleys had not been stolen in rage or desperation. They had been taken with the quiet patience of someone who wanted the world to see their absence and think of nothing but the neatness of it. Dorn closed his book and sat still, feeling the weight of the cold pressing against the walls. Somewhere in that silent stretch between the house and the town, something had happened that would not fit into the language of law, something that could not be written down without sounding like madness. And yet he knew it had been done by human hands, hands that had touched their coats and boots, set their coins in place, and left the table set so the story would begin with warmth. The kind of warmth that covers the moment when everything stops. Reverend Josiah Pike kept the ledger in a locked drawer beneath the altar, a heavy book with a cracked leather spine and pages that smelled faintly of candle smoke and damp wood. He did not give it over easily. When Sheriff Dorn asked for it, Pike hesitated long enough for the silence to grow uncomfortable, his hand resting on the drawer as though it contained something fragile enough to break under a stare. When he finally placed it on the desk, he kept his fingers on the cover for a moment before letting go. The book opened with the weight of years, each page marked with neat columns of names, dates, and amounts. The early entries were modest, sums that fit the lives of farmers, miners, and shopkeepers. But in late November, just weeks before the Rowleys vanished, their name appeared again and again in larger, bolder figures. The totals were impossible for a family of their means, equal to half a year's earnings in a single week. Dorn traced the pattern with his thumb, seeing how the donations had grown in sudden leaps, each one marked in the far margin with the same careful hand. The benefactor. No other family had such a notation. The ink was darker there, as though pressed more firmly into the paper, the letters upright and deliberate. Pike explained that it was not a church title nor a local name, but an arrangement known only between the donor and the giver. His voice was flat, but his eyes shifted to the window as if the name itself could draw something to the door. When pressed, he admitted the Rowleys had not come to Sunday service in the weeks before they disappeared, though their donations had continued. In the margins near their final entry, the Reverend's own pen had faltered, leaving a faint tremor in the last letter. It was dated the day before the snow began, and next to the amount in smaller writing were the words "Final Gift." Dorn asked what it meant, but Pike only said it was not his place to question blessings when they arrived. There was something rehearsed in that answer, the cadence of a man repeating a phrase told to him by someone else until it became part of his own thinking. The sheriff flipped further back and found that the benefactor appeared only rarely in the ledger's history, once in 1871 attached to a family lost in a mining accident, and once in 1864, beside the name of a widow who froze to death in her home though her pantry had been full. Each time the amounts were generous and far beyond the recipient's means. Each time the donation came just before the family was gone. Dorn closed the ledger and slid it back across the desk, but the weight of the book seemed to stay with him. There was a precision to the pattern, as if someone had been choosing their moment for years, marking their presence in the records of a place meant for trust. The Rowleys' sudden generosity was not kindness or luck. It was a signal, a final transaction between them and a figure who did not live in the town, but could reach into it without crossing the threshold. Outside, the snow had begun again, falling in small, soundless flakes that clung to the church windows. The sheriff stepped out into it with the name fixed in his mind, knowing it was not an alias born of whim but a title earned in repetition, a sign that the Rowleys had been claimed long before the night they vanished. And somewhere, he thought, the benefactor would already be looking for the next name to write. Anna Rowley had always been known for her bread. In the hills where winters could turn a pantry into an empty echo, she was the kind of woman who would appear on a doorstep with a warm loaf wrapped in linen, smiling softly as if she had been thinking of you all morning. People said her bread could carry a man through the coldest days, and those who had nothing were never turned away from her door. It was this habit that, in the weeks before her family vanished, seemed to grow into something more than kindness. She began baking in larger batches, sending Thomas to deliver loaves to families on the edge of the settlement, families chosen with no clear pattern except that they were quiet, private, and often overlooked. The bread was different then, heavier in the hand, dense enough to make a knife work for its slice. Most who received it were too hungry to think about why. When Sheriff Dorn, piecing together the fragments of the Rowleys' last days, asked about these gifts, one neighbor brought him a loaf she had kept frozen in her shed. She had been saving it for a day when her cupboards would run bare, but now she could not bring herself to eat it. Even through the linen it carried a faint, bitter smell, not of spoilage but of something that had never belonged in food. The sheriff cut it open on his desk, the crust flaking in hard shards, and found a thin, dark seam running just under the golden surface. It was not dough. It was a pressed layer of ash mixed with something fine and pale that did not dissolve when touched. It clung to the blade like dust from a long burned fire. The sample was sent to a regional laboratory, but the report came back with more questions than answers. The ash was wood, but of no local species, and the pale matter resisted every simple test. It was not flour, not salt, not bone meal as some suspected, but something organic that had been altered beyond recognition. The weight of the loaves, the sheriff thought, came from this hidden layer, pressed thin so it could not be seen until a slice exposed it. He began to wonder how many people in town had eaten from these loaves in the last weeks, never knowing what they were swallowing. Those who had taken Anna's bread spoke of her differently after that. They remembered how she had watched them take the first bite, her eyes steady, her hands folded in front of her as if she were waiting for something. A few recalled a strange aftertaste, a dryness that clung to the tongue, though none had grown ill. It was as if the bread was meant to mark them, not harm them, a private ritual disguised as charity. To the poor she had been a blessing. To Dorn, she was now a woman carrying out a task too deliberate to be mistaken for generosity. What troubled him most was the thought that Anna had baked each loaf with her own hands. This was not an act forced upon her under threat. It was careful work, measured and patient, repeated often enough to become routine. Whatever the ash and the pale substance were, they had been placed there with intent, and intent meant knowledge. It suggested that she understood exactly what the bread was for, that the gift she gave was not the bread itself, but the thing hidden inside it. The sheriff imagined her in the kitchen, the oven's heat pressing against her face, the loaves cooling on the table. He saw her brush the last streak of ash onto the hidden layer before sealing it in dough, knowing it would be carried into another home before the day was out. And somewhere, he thought, there was a reason for the heaviness, a reason for the weight that went beyond hunger or habit. The loaf on his desk had been cut and left open to the air, the seam of ash staring back like a wound. Outside, the snow kept falling, quiet as flour sifted from a hand, and the warmth of the bread began to fade. Whatever purpose it had served was finished, yet the sense of being marked by it lingered, an unseen line drawn between those who had eaten it and those who had not. And in that quiet line, he felt the shape of the next step waiting to be taken. The orchard lay under a thin glaze of frost, the trees black and brittle against the pale ground, their twisted branches holding the last shriveled apples like offerings that had been forgotten. Sheriff Dorn had walked its rows many times in his youth, but never with the sense that the earth itself was keeping a secret. It was Thomas Rowley's youngest brother who came from across the ridge, who pointed out the patch of ground where the snow had settled unevenly. A faint dip, no wider than a kitchen table, broke the otherwise smooth blanket. When the men cleared it, their shovels struck wood, not a crate or a root, but planks nailed edge to edge in a careful circle. The nails were driven from below as though whoever sealed it had been inside at the time. The boards came up slowly, the wood swollen with years of damp, until a mouth of darkness opened beneath them. The air that rose was still and sour, carrying the taste of old metal. When a lantern was lowered, the light showed walls of fitted stone slick with condensation, and in that glow hung the outlines of rusted chains anchored into the masonry. At the bottom, barely visible in the shifting halo, were glass jars, a dozen or more standing in precise formation as if someone had arranged them for display. Each was sealed with a thick cap of wax and wrapped in yellowed cloth that had once been white. The cloth bore hand-stitched initials in faded thread, each letter looped and deliberate. The first jar brought to the surface was heavier than it looked. Beneath the wax and the cloth, small bones rattled softly, too small to be mistaken for anything but those of children, their fragility preserved in the dry air. Some were whole, others broken clean as if cut, the ends smooth and pale. The initials on the cloth matched no one in the Rowley family, nor any recent graves in the county. The sheriff felt the cold weight of the thing in his hands and understood it was not a burial. It was a keep. As each jar was examined, the sameness of their preparation became clear. The bones had been stripped of every trace of flesh and arranged within the glass as neatly as a merchant's wares. The wax was thick enough to have kept out moisture for decades. The embroidery on the cloth was fine work, not rushed, and bore the care of someone who wanted the names remembered but not spoken. In the flicker of the lanterns, the row of jars seemed to stand in judgment, their silence heavier than the chains bolted to the walls. Dorn thought of the orchard above, how its roots would have drunk from the soil fed by whatever seeped from the well. For years, families had eaten the fruit, never knowing what nourished it. The idea was more than unsettling. It carried the shape of intent. Whoever had placed the jars there had chosen the orchard for a reason, had wanted the ground to take something in and return it in another form. It was a cycle closed so tightly that only the discovery of the well could break it. The men worked in silence, bringing each jar into the cold air, setting them on the grass in the same careful order they had been found. When the last was lifted out, the sheriff looked down into the empty stone shaft and saw that the chains were worn smooth at the points where they had been fastened to something living. Whatever had been held there had been kept long enough to rub away the roughness. The darkness at the bottom seemed to watch him, and he knew they had not reached the end of it. The jars were not trophies, and they were not graves. They were the record of a process, the visible part of a design that stretched beyond the Rowleys. And somewhere in that design was a hand that knew exactly how long the earth could be made to keep its secrets. Margaret Ashford had been a widow for nearly 15 years, living alone in the weathered house that shared a fence line with the Rowley orchard. In the days before they vanished, she had seen them more often than usual, passing between the trees or walking the narrow track toward the well. What stayed with her most was not their faces, but the white strips of cloth tied around each of their right wrists. The fabric was clean and new, cut in even lengths, the edges hemmed with a care that spoke of deliberate work. She had seen the children wearing them as they played in the snow, their small hands red from the cold, the cloth stark against their skin. When she asked Anna about it, standing with her basket on the front step, Anna had smiled in a way that made Margaret feel both noticed and dismissed. She said it was for the cleansing, as though the words themselves should carry meaning enough. Margaret had been to church every Sunday since she was a girl and had never heard of such a thing. It was not the kind of ornament the women of the hills wore, nor was it part of any service she had known. There was a strange unity in seeing the whole family marked that way, as if they were bound together in something apart from the rest of the town. In the fading light of that day, she watched them from her kitchen window as they carried baskets toward the orchard, the white bands catching the last sun, and it occurred to her that they moved with an odd stillness, not speaking to one another, as though whatever they carried was heavier than the baskets themselves. When Sheriff Dorn asked her about it, Margaret told him she could not stop thinking of the cloth. It was not decoration, and it was not protection from the cold. It was a sign, though, of what she could not say. The words Anna had used, for the cleansing, had lodged in her mind in a way that made her uneasy. Cleansing implied something unclean, and yet there had been no sickness in the Rowley house, no scandal, no sin whispered in the pews. It was as if they had been preparing for a rite that did not belong to any church but still carried the weight of belief. Margaret had known Anna for years, had traded sugar and flour with her across that fence, had seen her hold her children with the ease of a mother who loved without measure. That was what made the memory so hard to settle. The woman she knew could not be part of something that made her look through Margaret instead of at her, could not wear that calm smile while speaking of a thing she did not explain. And yet the image of them all with that strip of white at the wrist stayed sharp in her mind, as though it had been placed there for her to remember. Long after they were gone, Margaret would recall that moment at the door, the weight of Anna's gaze, the softness of her voice. She would think of the orchard, of the baskets, of the stillness in the Rowley yard, and she would wonder if the cloth had been a mark of choice or of claim, a sign they had tied on themselves or had tied for them. Either way, it had been the last thing she saw of them, the pale bands against the dark of their sleeves, moving toward the trees as if walking into a place that had been waiting for them all along. Dr. Horace Willoughby had been the county physician for nearly 3 decades, a man regarded with the quiet respect given to those who had seen more suffering than most and carried the knowledge to ease it. His office smelled of liniment and coal oil, its walls lined with neat shelves of jars and books that seemed harmless to anyone who did not know where to look. It was only when Sheriff Dorn, searching for any scrap that could connect the Rowleys' disappearance to something tangible, ran his hand along the back of the tallest shelf that he felt the faint give of wood cut to fit. The section swung open on hidden hinges, revealing a shallow cavity lined with dust and a single leather-bound ledger resting flat. It was heavier than it looked, the cover scarred and softened by use. The first pages were written in the practiced hand of a man who took pride in record-keeping, listing routine patient visits and the costs of medicine. But as Dorn turned further, the tone shifted. Names of rural families appeared alongside numbers far larger than the price of any treatment. The heading above these lists read simply, "Donations." The entries carried dates spanning nearly 20 years, always in groups of 3 or 4 names clustered together, followed by notations in a smaller script. Words like intake, subject retained, and final preparation. The ink was dark and steady, showing no hesitation in recording the words. The Rowleys' names appeared near the bottom of the most recent page. Beside them was the notation, "Final preparation, 3 remaining." Dorn felt a coldness take root in his chest as he read it. It was a phrase that belonged to no medical record he had ever seen, something that spoke of completion, of a process nearly finished. If there were 3 remaining, it meant others had come before, and those others had been marked in the same way. In the margins, faintly written and half erased, were figures that might have been weights or measures, but not of medicine. Numbers that suggested volume, mass, and yield, as if what was taken from these families had been quantified for use. The implication was not of healing, but of extraction, of turning lives into material for a purpose kept deliberately vague. The dates of the donations matched the winters when certain families had quietly disappeared, their absences explained away by migration, accident, or illness. None had been investigated. Willoughby's reputation as a healer had hidden the other work he kept in these pages. The ledger did not read like the diary of a madman. It was too calm, too ordered. Each entry was a piece of a larger method, a structure that had been refined over years until it no longer required justification. It was the record of someone who believed the work to be necessary, perhaps even noble, and who saw the families not as people but as participants in a design they would never understand. Dorn closed the ledger but kept the image of those 2 words, "final preparation," burned into his thoughts. It suggested an end point, a moment when the process reached completion and the subject was ready to be used. The question of what for hung heavier than the book itself. Somewhere in the gap between the neatness of the script and the horror of its meaning was the truth that the Rowleys had not been singled out for anything personal. They were simply the next to reach that final stage, part of a line that had stretched on for years, unseen and unbroken. The sheriff set the ledger down, knowing that the kind of mind that kept such records was not driven by rage or impulse, but by a discipline so complete it could hide in plain sight, wearing the face of a man trusted by everyone who came to him for help. It began as fragments, overheard in the low talk between neighbors who thought no one was listening. A widow remembered her grandmother speaking of winters, when families baked bread with a thin line of ash hidden beneath the crust. An old trapper recalled a woman in his youth who would carry such loaves to the sick, saying it was for their protection. Most of the stories ended with the same unspoken truth. Those who ate the bread lived, and others did not. Sheriff Dorn followed the threads until they led him to the dusty shelves of the county's oldest herbalist, where a stack of brittle journals recorded remedies and customs from the hills. In the cramped handwriting of a woman dead for nearly a century, he found the first complete account. The ash bread was part of a ritual not born of the church but older, rooted in the belief that purity could be passed from one body to another through what was consumed. The bread was given to those chosen to survive, but its power came only if others, called the cleansed, took the bread knowing it would be their last. The idea was as cold as it was precise. Those marked for survival were said to be bound together, their souls tied in a circle that disease could not cross. But the circle had to be sealed in sacrifice. Those outside it had to be purified through death, their bodies carrying away the sickness before it could reach the chosen. The ash was not common wood, but from a fire fed with herbs, bone, and something unnamed, the recipe passed quietly between those who believed. The pale dust found with the ash in Anna Rowley's bread might have been that missing element. What struck Dorn most was the balance in the ritual, the deliberate cruelty that wore the face of protection. It was not about killing for its own sake. It was about deciding who would live and giving them the comfort of believing their survival was earned, even righteous. The bread was not poison. It was a seal, a marker that the one who ate it was already claimed. Those who baked it had to know who they were sparing and who they were sending away. It was a kind of arithmetic carried out in kitchens and ovens, its sums measured in lives. The Rowleys had baked much of it in the weeks before they disappeared, giving loaves to the poorest and the most vulnerable. If the old accounts were true, then those families were never meant to survive the winter. Anna's smile at the door, the quiet watching as someone took the first bite, the white cloth on their wrists. It all fit into a pattern that had played out before in these hills. The ritual promised safety for the few, but only through the cleansing of the many. Dorn closed the journal with the feeling that he had touched something older than law, something that had endured because it could be hidden inside gestures of care. A loaf of bread, a warm hand, a word spoken softly enough to be mistaken for kindness. Whatever force or belief kept the ritual alive, it had passed into the Rowley house and shaped their last days. And somewhere in the mind of the one who had taught them, it was not murder at all, but the fulfillment of an obligation, a way to bind the living together while sending the rest into the cold, carrying the sickness away in their silence. Caleb Grange arrived in Monroe County the way a frost comes, quiet, unannounced, and without offering any clear reason to leave. He was an itinerant preacher by name, though no one could recall a church that claimed him. His sermons were held in barns or kitchens, never on a Sunday, and always by invitation. Those who met him remembered the unsettling stillness in his presence, the way his calm voice carried without effort and his pale eyes seemed to measure a person in silence before he spoke. He did not come with the fire and fury of a revivalist. He came with the tone of a man delivering instructions that had already been written. In every county he visited, he sought out certain families, never the loudest or most visible, but the ones who lived just far enough from town to be forgotten if they were gone. He called them worthy, though he never explained what earned that title. In the weeks before the Rowleys vanished, Grange was seen walking the back roads with Thomas, speaking in the low, deliberate way of men sharing matters not meant for others. He visited the orchard more than once, never staying long, and on each occasion Anna was seen at her window watching him leave. To neighbors, it seemed a harmless acquaintance, perhaps a shared interest in scripture or farming. But there was a pattern buried in his travels. In every place he passed through, a family would vanish within weeks of his departure, their absence explained away by sudden moves, illness, or accidents no one could prove. Records showed he had been present in the final months of at least 6 such disappearances over the past 15 years. Grange spoke often of cleansing, of the way the earth needed to be kept pure for the good of the living. He used the language of scripture but twisted it into shapes that carried meanings only he seemed to understand. His idea of removal was not exile. It was a setting apart, a taking away that he claimed was commanded from beyond mortal judgment. Those he marked never returned, and those left behind carried the vague sense that something necessary, though unspoken, had been done. When Sheriff Dorn learned of Grange's arrival in Monroe County, the timing sat heavy against the Rowleys' final days. The bread, the white clothes, the strange preparations all fit the pattern of a family being readied as though for a journey they would not return from. Grange had the discipline of a man who saw himself as an instrument rather than an actor. He did not force, he persuaded, guiding his choice with the patience of someone who believed their compliance was part of the ritual's strength. To the town, he was a courteous visitor with a gift for words. To those who followed his instruction, he was the hand of the will they feared to disobey. The truth of his work lay in the stillness he left behind. Fields untended, doors locked, chairs pushed in neatly under tables. No violence, no struggle, only the quiet order of lives ended in perfect alignment with a design no one could see. His arrival in Monroe was not a chance. It was the next line in a ledger written far from the reach of law, one in which the Rowleys' names had already been inked. And with their removal, his work here would be done, and he would move on, leaving behind nothing but the impression of a man who had passed through, spoken softly, and taken exactly what he came for. The snow behind the Rowley orchard lay unbroken except for a faint line that curved away from the last row of trees. It was not a road or a wagon path, but something narrower, worn just enough to leave a shallow impression beneath the frost. Sheriff Dorn knelt to study it, brushing away the powder until the shapes came clear. Barefoot prints pressed deep before the ground had frozen hard. Some were small enough to belong to a child, others broader, heavier. The stride steady and unhurried. The trail wound into the woods in a single file, the kind of procession that suggested order, not flight. Whoever had walked it had done so willingly, without struggle, their feet numb to the cold or past caring. The prints led east, weaving between the bare trunks until they reached the rim of the old quarry. The pit yawned, black and silent, its walls streaked with ice where water had seeped through the stone. But it was the ground at the edge that stopped Dorn. The snow gave way to scorched earth, the burn marks uneven but wide enough to speak of a fire that had raged hot and high. Charred fragments of wood lay half buried in ash, their grain warped from heat. Scattered among them were shapes too white to be stone. He knelt again, sifting through the grit until his glove closed around one. It was a tooth, human, the root still intact. A few steps away, another and another. Some were small, the enamel barely formed. Others bore the wear of years. In the center of the burn site, the ash was piled thick, layered with the fine black dust that came from more than wood alone. The wind caught it and lifted it in slow spirals, carrying it out over the quarry before letting it fall into the darkness below. To anyone who did not look closely, it might have seemed a place where a body, or many bodies, had been laid to rest by fire, a burial in the open air under the winter sky. But the neatness of the path leading here, the absence of bindings or signs of violence, told another story. This was not the aftermath of killing in haste. It was a rite carried out in its proper place, its steps followed exactly. The old quarry had been abandoned for decades, its pit a place the town's children were warned to keep away from. It offered seclusion, stone to hold the heat, and a drop deep enough to take what the fire could not consume. The phrase "burial in God's light" came to Dorn unbidden, echoing something Caleb Grange had once been heard to say about the purifying power of fire under an open heaven. The prints, the fire, the teeth, each piece was part of a design that demanded the bodies be returned to the elements in a way that left nothing whole. The ash would scatter into the quarry, the teeth would fall beyond reach, and the ground would freeze over before anyone came looking. Dorn stood at the rim and tried to picture the moment itself. The slow procession through the orchard, the line of bare feet on the frozen trail, the stillness as they reached the edge. In the mind of the one who led them, this was not murder but deliverance, the final act in a process that began long before the Rowleys ever stepped onto that path. The quarry was the altar, the fire the offering, the night sky the witness, and when it was done, the trail would vanish with the snow, leaving only the scorch marks to hint at what had happened here. The sheriff turned back toward the orchard, following the line of prints in reverse. Each step felt heavier, as though he were walking against the current of a river that had carried others away. Somewhere ahead, the trees stood quiet, holding the first shadows of evening, and beyond them lay the house with its cold table and untouched coats. The fire at the quarry had burned everything but the shape of the act itself, a shape that was becoming clearer with each step he took toward what remained. The quarry pit, when first seen in daylight, looked like nothing more than a wound in the earth, its walls sheer and streaked with winter ice, its base sunken into shadow. But when the crews began to clear the scorched earth at the edge, the shape of the place shifted into something far more deliberate. Beneath the first layer of ash and blackened stone lay the charred outlines of wooden frames, the remnants arranged in neat rows as if they had once been seats. The spacing was uniform, the angle aligned toward a single open space at the center. In another life, they could have been pews, their grain now warped and crumbling under the touch, the heat having erased their purpose but not their order. Near the center of the burn site, the soil was darker, almost fused, and when it was dug away, coils of rope were found buried beneath it. The strands were worn smooth where they had once been tightened against flesh, the fibers polished by the friction of movement that had stopped abruptly. They had not been left in a heap. Each length was looped and knotted in the same way, laid parallel as if part of a setting to be used again. Scattered among them were hard, glassy lumps that caught the light when turned. Closer inspection revealed they were melted shards of bottles and lantern chimneys. The glass flowed and hardened into strange shapes when the fire had burned at its highest heat. Some pieces had fused to bone, the pale fragments embedded in them like insects in amber. It was among this layer that a small metal shape was uncovered, its surface buckled and blackened but still recognizable as a watch. The crystal was gone, the face blistered, yet the hands were frozen at 11:46 p.m. The engraving on the back, faint but legible, read TR, a gift Thomas Rowley had been known to wear. The sheriff held it in his palm, the stop time marking a moment that could never be placed into words. Whatever had happened here had ended in that minute, the last trace of the Rowleys' lives sealed inside a circle of ash. The arrangement of the site was impossible to ignore, the rows of burned frames facing the central space, the ropes placed with care, the remains of glass that once held light. It was the structure of a gathering, not of a killing ground born of chaos. The quarry had been transformed into a place of assembly where those present were seated to face something or someone, bound in a way that allowed no leaving. The fire had come after, not as a frenzy, but as the final act, cleansing the space of all but its outline. To stand in the middle of it was to stand in a church built for no god recognized by any faith in the county. The thought that crept into Dorn's mind was colder than the air. Whoever arranged this did not see themselves as a murderer. They saw themselves as a conductor, leading a service where every element had meaning. The pews were for witness, the ropes for stillness, the glass for light, and the fire for the end. The stopped watch was the benediction, the moment the rite was sealed. In the mind that designed it, the quarry was not a grave. It was an altar, the open sky its ceiling, the pit its foundation. When the crews withdrew for the day, the sheriff remained at the rim looking down into the blackened geometry. It was not the disorder of violence, but the discipline of belief that chilled him. Somewhere the one who had built this had done so with the calm of a craftsman, certain that their work was necessary and that those who burned had stepped into their places willingly. The snow began to fall again, dusting the ash, and soon the shapes of the rows were softened, the edges blurred. But beneath that thin white cover, the pattern would remain, waiting for the next eyes to find it and see the truth in its design. In the counties where Caleb Grange had passed before, his name was remembered with a strange mix of fondness and unease. He arrived alone, never carrying more than a satchel and a worn Bible, his boots clean even after miles of road. He would take lodging with a church deacon or a widow in need of company, offering to fix fences, mend steps, or tend to the sick without ever asking for payment. To the poor he brought bread and salt pork, sometimes coal in the deep winter. To the sick he sat at their bedsides, holding their hands while he murmured prayers that did not sound like the hymns they knew but felt comforting all the same. He had a gift for making the lonely feel chosen, and the dying believe they were seen. There was never a reason to doubt him at the moment, yet behind the warmth he offered was a pattern too exact to be called chance. In every settlement he visited, within weeks of his departure an entire family would vanish. It was never the largest or most prominent household, but one that others could quietly explain away. Perhaps they had moved to join kin or been taken by sickness or run into some private misfortune best left unspoken. Grange never stayed to see the aftermath, but he left a seed behind, a set of words and gestures that shaped how people thought of the missing. He called their absence a blessing, a sign they had been called to something greater, removed from the burdens of the world so the rest could carry on without fear. The way he spoke it left little room for grief. He gave people permission to turn their eyes away and keep their lives untouched. The testimonies from those places told of his gentleness, his patience, his habit of listening more than speaking. But within those same accounts lay quiet admissions, strange gifts he gave before leaving, like white strips of cloth or bread heavy enough to seem more than flour. He never asked anything of those he chose, at least not openly. The request, if it came at all, was wrapped in the language of preparation, of making peace with the days ahead. Those who vanished often seemed calmer in their last weeks, as if they had been told a truth no one else could understand. Dorn understood then that Grange's power did not come from force. It came from belief, his own and the kind he could plant in others. He had no need to drag his chosen away. He guided them until they stepped into the path themselves, convinced they were moving toward light instead of fire. And when they were gone, he left communities with a story that dulled the edge of suspicion. To question what had happened was to question a gift from God, and most people would rather live with a lie than face the shape of the truth. In the records of those towns, the gaps remained, houses emptied without sale, orchards left to rot, names scratched off church rolls. And in the quiet between the lines, Caleb Grange's shadow lingered, never accused, never pursued. A man remembered for kindness while the ground beneath each place held the memory of those who had walked away with him. Monroe County, Dorn realized, was only the most recent page in a ledger written in footsteps and silence. And the Rowleys had been written into it long before anyone thought to ask why. By the time the thaw came in the spring of 1880, the trail to Caleb Grange had grown thin, stretched across counties where his name was more memorable than man. It was a drifter's trail, marked not by what he left behind in life but in absence. Houses gone dark, orchards untended, and the slow decay of places no one wanted to inherit. When the law finally cornered him, it was not in a church or a roadside camp but in the skeleton of an abandoned grist mill, a hulking shape on the edge of a river swollen with meltwater. The place had been dead for decades, its wheel long rotted, its windows blackened with years of dust. Yet inside there was warmth. The iron-bellied stove in the far corner glowed with a low fire as though someone had only just stepped away. The lawmen entered quietly, the boards groaning under their boots. The air held the strange stillness of a room that was both recently lived in and utterly deserted. On the floor, in the open space where the grinding stones had once turned, stood 12 glass jars. They were large enough to require both hands to lift, each sealed in a thick layer of wax and marked with a strip of linen tied tight around the neck. The linen bore names in black ink, written in a careful, upright hand that allowed no smudge or flourish. One name stopped the sheriff cold: Rowley. Another was Margaret Ashford's cousin from a neighboring county. Others matched families whose vanishings had been whispered but never recorded. The jars were not placed at random. They formed a perfect circle, each one facing inward, the gaps between them measured to the width of a palm. At the center of the circle lay nothing but a scatter of fine gray ash, so light it shifted when the door's draft moved through. The labels on the jars were unweathered, the wax still smelling faintly of smoke, as if they had been sealed that very morning. When the sheriff lifted the one marked Rowley, he felt the weight inside shift and heard the dull, granular movement of ash against glass. It was not the remains of a single body. It was too little for that. It felt divided, portioned, as though each jar contained only a part of something larger. The stove in the corner gave off the kind of heat meant to keep more than a man warm. It was for preservation, for keeping what was in the jars from damp until it could be moved. Yet there was no bedding, no food, no sign Grange had lived here longer than a night. He had come only to finish whatever had begun months earlier. The perfect geometry of the jars, the neat handwriting, the low, steady fire, all of it was the mark of a man who planned not for chaos but for completion. Outside, the river carried chunks of ice downstream, their edges catching the late sun. Inside, the lawmen stood in a circle of their own, reading the names and understanding that they had come not to stop an act in progress, but to witness the remains of one already done. Grange was gone, and with him went the only mind that knew why these families had been chosen, why their names now sat in glass prisons warmed by a fire that would die by morning. The sheriff turned from the stove, the heat still clinging to his back, and saw the empty doorway framing the gray light beyond. Somewhere out there, the quiet hand that had arranged these jars was already moving toward the next circle, and the law, as it had always been with him, had arrived just a little too late. In the decades after the Rowleys were taken, Monroe County learned how to speak of them without saying their names too often. The orchard, once heavy with fruit, grew wild and brittle, its limbs splitting under the weight of storms. People stopped walking that stretch of road after dark, not from fear of attack, but because of the feeling that the place itself was listening. In 1902, long after most who had known the family were buried themselves, the county raised a small memorial where the first row of trees met the field. It was nothing ornate, just a stone post with an iron plaque bearing the words, "In memory of the taken, their silence, our warning." No date, no names. The space between the lines was left for the stories that could not be agreed upon. Children were brought there on summer afternoons and told not about the orchard, but about the danger of letting strangers into your home, even those who came with scripture and bread. The caution was always the same. Kindness is not proof of goodness, but the case was never closed. The sheriff's files were passed from one successor to the next, each one reading through them in winter when the work was slow, each one reaching the same quiet dead end. There were no charges, no trial, no grave to mark the truth. Caleb Grange remained a ghost in the records, his name spoken in the county only when someone wanted to measure the reach of a lie. What survived most vividly was not the facts, but the shape of the story. How a man could come into a place, leave it warmer than he found it, and still carry something away that could not be replaced. Over the years, scholars from distant cities came to Monroe, drawn by the strangeness of a case where the evidence was heavy and the guilt invisible. Some called Grange a zealot, a man so fixed on a vision of purity that he could arrange deaths as if they were blessings. Others argued he was a con man, preying on superstition to gain influence and control. His rituals nothing more than theater for an end no one had lived to explain. A few suggested something older, a kind of belief that ran beneath religion, using its language but answering to no god that anyone could name. They studied the jars, the cloth, the notes in Willoughby's ledger, and agreed only on this. The pattern was not random, and it was not improvised. It had been done before and would be done again in some form, somewhere beyond their reach. For those who still lived in the county, the debate meant little. They did not need scholars to tell them what the memorial already said in its silence. Evil did not need to announce itself, did not need horns or rage or blood in the open. It needed only to seem useful, to stand in the doorway with calm eyes and a promise that sounded like mercy. That was the danger of Caleb Grange. He was not the shadow at the edge of the road, but the man who walked beside you all the way home. On autumn nights when the wind moved through the orchard and rattled the dry branches together, some claimed it sounded like low voices in prayer. Most ignored it. The county had lived too long with the knowledge that certain things could not be put right, and that speaking them aloud only called them closer. So the Rowleys remained where they had always been, in the space between memory and myth, their absence a lesson passed down like scripture, their story a reminder that what destroys is not always what strikes, but what convinces you to open the door in the first place. And in that unbroken quiet, the legacy of Caleb Grange endured, not in the ground he touched, but in the hearts that still carried the fear of kindness offered too easily.